So we are pleased to have today two speakers from Oxfam. Anam Parvez-Bhatt. Anam is the Gender Justice Research Lead at Oxfam Great Britain, where she provides intellectual leadership in research and data analysis on gender inequality and women's economic empowerment. Today we also have Namali Jayasinghe. Namali is the Gender and Women's Rights Researcher at Oxfam America, where she works on a learning agenda on issues of women's rights and gender transformative leadership. Anam and Namali, we are thrilled to have you here today. As you can see by the number of people who registered and just the response we had to this webinar, this is a topic that is very, that is of interest to our community, and we are really pleased to have you today with us. Thank you so much, and please go ahead and start.
Great, thanks, Diana. Anam, did you want to go ahead and start? Sorry, Anam, are you there? Apologies.
We may give it a few seconds if the mic was muted. So I think Anam will be starting the presentation.
It looks like her headset has gone. So why don't I go ahead and start, and then Anam can join us later. Everyone, it's very nice to meet you, and we're so happy to see the number of people joining. It's quite impressive, and we're very excited to share this information with you about integrating gender in research planning. Just to give a little bit of background, we recently published research guidelines on how to integrate gender, published by Oxfam. And I thought it'd be helpful just to give a little idea of why we went ahead and did something like that. Basically, Oxfam, we, as gender researchers, both Anam and myself, kept fielding queries and questions about, well, you know, I want to incorporate gender in my research, but I just don't know how. It's very intimidating. I'm afraid I might cause harm if I try to do so. So just trying to figure out, like, it would be really great to have some sort of guidelines. And so we're together with the Gender Working Group, which is basically members of the Oxfam Confederation who are really interested in gender research. We got together with them to come up with a set of guidelines and a gender rubric, of which we will share with you today some of the basic ideas behind it. And it was actually a really long process. It took about, I want to say, almost 2 years, where we would put together some sort of model, some initial ideas, and share it with our colleagues at Oxfam America, at Oxfam Great Britain, and the wider Gender Working Group community, and basically, you know, got their feedback, hashed things out in order to finalize and develop the gender research guidelines, which are available online, and which we would be happy to share the links with you later on. So that's just sort of a little bit of the background behind the gender research guidelines. So for today, here you can see in your screen, this is a plan of what we want to cover today, going through the basic principles on gender transformative research that we developed based on a review of feminist scholarship, to looking at the gender rubric, where we have ways of gauging how well a research project has integrated gender or not, and then looking at what this rubric would mean a bit more specifically for financial inclusion. And then lastly, my colleague Anam will take it over again to talk about incorporating a feminist perspective across the research cycle, before we end with a discussion session and a Q&A, where we have an opportunity to discuss questions and to hear from and learn from your experiences. So hopefully, despite the restrictions of this platform, we'll be able to have some level of engagement from you as we go along. But before we go into the nitty-gritty details of the principles, we thought it'd be great to hear from you about what are some of the barriers, challenges, obstacles you have faced when integrating gender in your research. So take a second to think about it, and then in the chat box, it'd be great if you could go ahead and type what's going on, some of the challenges that you faced, and then we would love to just hear from one or two of you, and I'm sure the other audience members would just love to read and know that they're not alone in their struggles to do what we call gender transformative research. And while you're thinking, I can let you know, I can give you an example from my own experience as a gender researcher. So for example, I think as a gender researcher, I want to make sure that my research process is as participatory and collaborative as possible, meaning that I'm engaging with the key stakeholders and potential interviewees from the very beginning of the research process, from developing the research questions all the way to conducting the data, to doing the analysis and finalizing the research report. However, working at Oxfam with our internal deadlines and all our processes, that's really hard to do because being collaborative takes time, and oftentimes we just don't have that luxury. So it could, being collaborative and participatory can be very difficult, if not impossible. So just wanted to, just to let you know, that's a struggle I face as a gender researcher quite often. Anam, are you there? It would be great to hear if you have. Okay, perfect.
Can you hear me? I'm so sorry about that. I apologize, everybody. I don't know what happened to my microphone. But just to share a couple of challenges that I've come across from my experience of working as a gender researcher and supporting others in integrating a stronger gendered perspective in their research. I think one of the things that we're faced with a lot is a lack of evidence and gender data gaps. And particularly when supporting others, gender, I find, is sometimes treated by those commissioning or conducting research as an add-on and not a central dimension of the topic at hand. So as gender advisors or those providing support, we're often brought on board quite late in the stage of the research cycle. Another thing that I come across, and I'm told by colleagues who would like to strengthen a gender perspective in the research, is a lack of practical tools and a lack of a systematic approach to integrating gender throughout the research cycle. So not just at the end once the report has been written as a paragraph on gender to be inserted. So just my perspective on that.
Perfect. Yeah, there's so many issues, I think. And there was a question in the chat box about what is gender transformative research, and absolutely, we're gonna, in the next slide, I'm gonna go into a bit more details about what are some of the underlying principles around how we define gender transformative research as Oxfam, but again, this is based on feminist research. We also have somebody sharing their experiences about conducting focus group discussions going haywire when asked questions related to power asymmetry in the community between genders. Yeah, focus group discussions can be quite the, the power keg, if you will, where you can really see all of the uncomfortable power dynamics inherent within, and it can sometimes be interesting for the research and can be finding in and of itself, but it could also just go down a path you don't really want to go to, right? So there's a lot of challenges because when you're working in gender issues, you're working in questions of power, and that can get very messy when you're trying to conduct a research project. And if any other challenges or barriers come up to mind as you go along, please let us know in the chat box, because I think it'd be great just to review it later on and to share with others who are participating in the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. So here you can see we're discussing what the gender transformative principles of research are to keep in mind, and noting that these are building on a body of feminist scholarship, feminist theory. So one of the main principles is that, gender transformative research recognizes that gender norms are shaped by unequal and patriarchal power relations that lead to discrimination against women and other members of what we are calling gender diverse groups, but have also been described as LGBT groups or intersectional and gender minorities. We are also recognizing in gender transformative research that women and other members of gender diverse groups should be at the heart of the analysis, that we should really challenge ourselves to go beyond the binaries of, talking about people as, here's just women and here's just men, recognizing there's a lot more nuances in terms of the way that we have our gender identities. And related to that, we have here on the purple sort of petal of this flower of intersectionality, which is basically, examining intersecting forms of marginalization and discrimination. And with intersectionality, we're basically talking about how, the discrimination or the experience of the world that we have is related to how our gender interacts with other forms of our identity, whether it's ethnicity, religion, age, location, what have you. So for example, we're thinking about, let's say, I'm working on a research project with women in Sri Lanka. Am I working with, Sinhalese women living in an urban community? Am I working with Muslim women working in a fishing community, or Tamil women working in the north, which was a former conflict zone? All of these things intersect to create the way that women experience the world, and also different levels of discrimination, which is important to have in the analysis. And that again relates to another aspect of gender transformative research, which is that context matters, right? I mean, it seems kind of obvious, but we should always factor in what is going on in terms of political, economic, social, what have you, factors in the context that we're studying. Research should also promote social change, and I think for considering the audience that we're talking with, I think this is pretty evident that we all are doing this work because we want to see positive change in the world. But I think the aspect of gender transformative research, feminist research, is that is a definite outcome or a definite goal of the research in and of itself. And lastly, we wanted to also flag that one of the aspirational goals of gender transformative research is being participatory. Right. Again, like what I was talking about, again, one of my challenges is like, how do we engage people throughout the research process? Because we need to recognize that research is an act of power, where, as an INGO like Oxfam, we're going into communities with our research questions, we do the interviews, and then we write the analysis, and we choose which quotes to put into the report versus other quotes. And all of that is, has very powerful dynamics that are important to keep in mind, and also think of ways to mitigate against them, whether it's like, for example, doing a validation workshop where you share the draft research findings with the participants so they have an opportunity to provide input. So in our next slide, we have our gender rubric going all the way from gender blind to gender transformative as the main goal, which recognizes and informs long-term practical changes in norms and gendered power relations. And I want to just, flag that this is quite a challenging level to get to. It's something I know I also have my struggles with, but it's something I think that's, the act of trying to get to gender transformative research is very useful and very powerful process. So to give you more details about what we mean by each of these, going from gender blind all the way to gender transformative. And I should flag, when it comes to terminology around gender blind, since we made the guidelines publicly available, we actually got some feedback saying that the use of gender blind was actually ableist language, and that we should instead use a different term. And so we are thinking about that, and we're thinking about maybe using gender exploitative or gender exclusionary. So if any of you have an alternative use of gender blind that's not ableist, do let us know, because we do want to change that in the guidelines. So just to give a little bit of explanation of what I mean by the others. So with gender aware research tends to treat women or gender issues as sort of a side note. There's no explicit research question on gender issues. You tend to see a lot of terminology around, just talking about women as very, very briefly, poverty in this community is really problematic, particularly for women, period. There's no explanation of how poverty is really impacting women, or there's no real analysis going through what's going on there when it comes to women and other gender diverse groups. And then gender sensitive, we're seeing gender disaggregated data. It's throughout the research process, but perhaps it doesn't really question the traditional roles of women, for example, where let's say women's role of providing food and water for their household is analyzed, but doesn't really question the inherent power dynamics of the household in the research. So, treating gender roles as, given, expected, and unquestioned. And then we get to gender responsive, where we're seeing more of an intersectional analysis and analysis of the structural power relations at multiple levels, but perhaps we're not, as participatory, collaborative in the research process as we like. And then we have gender transformative, which, again, the amazing goal, the holy grail that we want to achieve, where, we're including gender disaggregated. We have been participatory in our research process, and we are really questioning the structural power relations and norms underlying our research question as it relates to gender. So the next slide, I'm going to just go through super briefly. It is applying this rubric in the context of financial inclusion research. And I know there's a lot of words, but we wanted to include this slide so when you, after the webinar, you can read it a bit more closely and let us know if you have any questions. But just to give you a sense, like if you look at gender responsive, we are looking at how research explores how access to and benefits from finance and resources are gendered by looking at legal and institutional barriers, considers gender bias in data, it disaggregates gender data, it looks at differences between men's and women's experiences, but perhaps, again, we're missing the participatory collaborative process, the research process. So hopefully what you're getting from this review of the gender rubric, that it's not only about what you research, it's not only about the research topic, it's also how you conduct the research, right? How do you engage with research participants? How do you form the research project team? And how do you collaborate, let's say, with, key experts such as feminist and women's rights organizations in the course of your research? So moving on. So we thought that it would be interesting, hopefully, to go through 3 exercises with you around where we basically share little snippets of research reports on gender, and we'll just give you a little bit of a background on each, and then you can let us know through a poll where you think it would fall in the gender rubric, right? So this is, again, just having you play around with what's going on with this research. So the first one is an Oxfam report. It's a Saving for Change in Mali, looking at financial inclusion. And our Saving for Change program is basically these women's groups that we put together that built upon this traditional rotating savings and credit associations. And it's been a project that we've been having for quite some time. And we put together this research project looking into how this example of collective action, civic engagement of women involved in savings for change could incorporate measures of political accountability. Looking at how they can have some sort of influence on political authorities using their engagement in saving for change as sort of like an enabling point. So that's sort of like the background. And then this is the main sort of reflections from the research report, or the main findings, where they found that in the research, the act of having saving for change did allow women to successfully mobilize, even if they weren't able to achieve any sort of impact due to restrictions of local political, local politicians, and the motivation of local politicians being also really minimal. Women found that the act of coming together towards a shared political end was empowering, and that the research also found that the Saving for Change project was shifting what was permissible for women. So therefore, really critiquing and transforming traditional notions of women's role versus men's roles versus what have you in these communities. However, in terms of a critique of this research, we find that how women were involved in the research process was unpacked. It was unclear if women were involved in the research design apart from interview participants, and no validation exercises were conducted. So let's stop there and let's see if we could put up the poll. And you take a few seconds to think about where you think, if it's blind, meaning gender is not included at all, or gender aware in the sense that, women may be included as a side note, or gender sensitive, where we do have some engagement of gender throughout, but, maybe we're not really questioning the power dynamics, to gender responsive, where it could be intersectional but not maybe participatory, to gender transformative. So if you could go ahead and take a few seconds and go ahead and input your answers. Great. Let us know when we have the answers for the poll.
I think let's give it another second. I see people are still clicking.
Pondering.
We have about 30. So we have over half of the people who have taken the poll. So
perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Choose the one that you think is the closest.
Yeah. And I should note, like we just came up with these I guess levels in the rubric, but there could be some bleeding in between where, like, is it sensitive, is it responsive, or is it, I think gender blind is probably the easiest one to be like, okay, this is a gender blind report, but.
All right, so I think then one more second any last minute. All right, I will close the poll right now.
Great, perfect. And by the way, for the reports that we reference in the webinar, we'd be happy to share the links for them as well.
And
okay, so
I think see the results. Okay,
I can see the results. So it seems like we are between sensitive and responsive the most. And yeah, I think that would be, based on the information you have on these two slides, I would say that's kind of accurate. I would have probably said this is more towards a gender responsive report, because it does sort of question the traditional notions of women's roles and, involved in the Savings for Change community and getting involved in political office. I think more details would be needed to see how intersectional it is in order to be truly gender responsive. But I think, yeah, I think everybody is definitely on the same page here when it comes to understanding the rubric. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions about that. Type it in the chat box. If we can't get it at the end of the presentation, we'll respond later when Anam and I have a chance to go through them. So for the second one, this is again another Oxfam report. We thought it'd be good to critique us as opposed to other organizations. So this is another report looking at cash transfers in Nairobi slums, looking at food security. And the research question was looking at how cash transfers can improve the food and livelihood security of the most food insecure households in Nairobi's settlements. And so they were looking at a number of things, and they were really looking at reaching the poorest groups, particularly women, because of women's role in managing household affairs. However, the research report acknowledges that the project did not explicitly have gender inequality as an aim of the research project. It should also note this, and this is all the report, like I'm pulling language directly from the report. This is why I love it, because it's so brutally honest. But it said that women were not directly involved in the design stage of the program. There were no discussions among the staff around, what were the gender context of the research, and sex disaggregated data or gender disaggregated data was not included. So in terms of sort of like the program's reflections that we got from the report, they found that even though they didn't talk about gender from the beginning, they noticed that there was something going on, surprise, surprise, when it comes to gender roles, but they left it unquestioned, that the traditional gender roles within the home were still there. There was no early gender analysis, they say, because of resource constraints. And actually, interestingly enough, they noted that there were concerns that when the project ended, the cash transfer program ended, there were fears that tensions would result because there would be a struggle to meet day-to-day needs. And so I think that's actually a really key thing to remember, that if you don't have a gender analysis in your research, this could actually lead to unintended negative consequences, right? So that's also something to factor in. So based on what we've just sort of very briefly described about this research report, where do you think it would fall on the gender rubric?
I see people are ready with their responses this time around. The polling is moving faster. Good. We had good practice, and we have one more exercise just so people know.
Perfect. Yeah. And I really think this is a great report to read, because again, it was very reflective on its shortcomings, which I think is huge, and we learned so much from that.
All right, maybe another 15 seconds for everybody to get their responses in.
Great, great.
All right, I think we're good. I'm going to close the poll.
All right, let's see.
And let's see that.
Yeah, okay, good. So no one thought this was transformative.
Great.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, I can see there is a bit of a tie between it being gender blind and gender aware. I think because they did mention women very briefly, granted it wasn't really explored in any way. I can't say that it's completely gender blind. It's more gender aware, but yeah, it's a bit of a cutoff. But yes, I think in terms of its analysis of its findings, I think it's leaning more towards gender aware in terms of being like, oh, this is something that we can do better. So with that, I'm going to stop and pass over the presentation to Anam to talk about the final exercise.
Great. Thanks, Namali. So I thought I would maybe share a non-Oxfam example and balance it out a bit. So Mind the Gap is a study that was carried out by CARE in Rwanda in 2011 to explore how gender dynamics influence both the processes and the outcomes of the village savings and loans methodology that they use in a range of their programming work in livelihoods, reproductive health, as well as financial inclusion. And the study really powerfully finds that gendered social norms and power relations really do impact the ways in which women and men, male members of these groups, access money for savings, how they invest loans taken from the group, and the extent to which they have decision-making authority regarding the use of the loans that they take on and the control over assets purchased with those loans. As far as how gender is integrated in the report, so it is explicitly, as you can see, included in the objectives of the study, and also extends beyond exploring simply the different experiences of women and men participating in village saving loans groups, to also look at the structural barriers to their participation and benefits, such as social norms and power relations. The research process also adopts a reflexive approach, which I thought was very unique, and I've not come across this a lot in the research that I've done or I've read up on. But they basically reserve a space for critical learning and reflection on gender and power by their own staff as well as the research team. Then the data that is collected and analyzed is also disaggregated by sex. However, if we were to critique the research, it was unclear how participatory the research was. It just said that they took a participatory approach, which doesn't really tell us much. And it also does not explore intersectionality. And so women and men were being presented as homogeneous groups. So yes, if you can take just a couple of minutes to rank this on the gender rubric. how are we doing?
Yeah, it's in progress. People are still answering.
Okay, all right. This one's not that straightforward, so.
That's good. Yeah. All right. People are still answering. All right, maybe another 3-4 seconds for any last minute responses. All right, let's see what the results are.
Yeah.
All right.
Ah, brilliant. That's what I had ranked it as well. So I see that, yes, people are leaning towards responsive, and that is how I had ranked it as well. And this is a really interesting example of a piece of research that, despite examining and addressing, structural power relations, norms, and those underlying barriers to gender equality, is not necessarily gender transformative. Because it doesn't, in the way that the research is conducted and presented, adopt an intersectional approach in its analysis. And I mean, we don't have enough information of this, but it seems that, it's not clear whether they have strived for a meaningful participation of different and particularly gender diverse and socially excluded groups. So yes, great. Do I have control over the presentation?
Yes, I made you a presenter.
Okay, so let me know if you can see my slides change.
I can see it.
Great, brilliant. So then I will be moving on to the next part of the presentation, which is around, how can we really adopt a systematic approach to incorporating a gender perspective across the research cycle. And this is really recognizing that to ensure that our research is really or is making progress towards being gender transformative, we really need to be thinking of how we incorporate a gender perspective across the entire research cycle. So not simply, as I mentioned earlier, a gender paragraph to be added to a report once it's written, but to really take into account gender issues from the very beginning, from the selection of our topics and our methodology, to the design of our surveys or focus group discussions, to the analysis of the data from primary or secondary sources, all the way to how we present and influence around our findings, really having, gender related issues at the back of our mind and gender related questions. We also need to be aware of the gender biases, sometimes our own, that can and do oftentimes creep in at different stages of the research cycle, affecting, how we might end up feeding into rather than challenging the problematic narratives around gender. So I'll be taking each of these stages and talking about them in turn. So as a first step to incorporating a gendered perspective in our research, we really need to be thinking about and integrating gender issues into the conceptualization of our research topic by really asking ourselves, what are the gender dimensions of our topic? How do social norms, power relations, and other structural factors underlying gender inequality affect our research topic? So a common bias that enters here is that, well, gender is not really a cross-cutting issue. It isn't really relevant to the research topic of interest. And though the dimensions may not be readily obvious, I'm fairly certain that there are articles or reports on gender and the topic in question out there which you can review, which can shed some light on these links. So, for example, the links between gender equality and financial inclusion, not to this audience, but otherwise to others, may not always be apparent. Or where they are, the focus might be on, say, explicit gender biases resulting from, specific provisions of credit, resources that deliberately treat men and women differently. So gender biases in lending or discriminatory laws that mandate that married women need permission from their husbands or from male members of their family for opening bank accounts. Implicit biases are less obvious, yet more insidious. where the markets in which those financial products and services are introduced actually interact with and are shaped by the way that the society structures and behaves to end up affecting women and men's well-being differently. So, for example, an interesting study I came across by CGAP shows how in Pakistan, harmful gender norms, for instance, around how mobile money is considered to be more for men than for women, as men are breadwinners, or how mobiles corrupt and misguide women and girls, have actually limited women's ability to make financial decisions on their own, to operate a mobile phone, and to avail financial products and services, and has ended up widening the gender access gap over the past 10 years. So a gender-sensitive study in this context then would explore potentially how women and men access and benefit from financial services and products differently. A gender transformative study would take it one step further and would look at the underlying gendered social and economic realities of women and men in the specific context that these services then interact with to potentially reinforce, reproduce, or weaken inequalities. So informed by this understanding, you might decide to include a research question that looks more closely at one of these implicit biases or ask questions differently. So a gender transformative approach to doing research on financial inclusion then would stem from a recognition that women and men and other marginalized groups access to and benefit from these services or participation in or benefit from paid work is influenced by a number of factors taking place at different levels, at the individual, relational, institutional, and other levels. And how then, through our research, we need to make sure that, they're being understood within this context and ecosystem of factors influencing the choices, actions, and livelihoods of our research subjects or participants. So then moving on to the methodology. So when developing our methodology, then it's important to understand that there are no inherently gender feminist methods, but that all research that aims to be gender transformative should be grounded in a methodology that seeks to overcome gender biases, recognizes the central role of gender inequalities, norms, and unequal power relations, treats women and gender diverse groups as central to the analysis, uses an intersectional approach, etc. And in terms of the methods, both quantitative and qualitative methods, and I realized that there was a question about this, but both quantitative and qualitative methods can actually be useful for furthering our understanding of gender inequalities, and which you really use depends on your research questions and the purpose of your research. So quantitative methods are useful for highlighting existing gender inequalities, examining aggregate trends, tracking progress on critical dimensions, and importantly, for putting issues on the political and policy agenda. Qualitative methods, on the other hand, are useful when we're trying to understand the why from people themselves about their lived experiences, in better understanding, what really drives certain trends, and in better capturing difficult to measure concepts. And when we integrate them, magic happens, or the fact that these different approaches can provide really complementary perspectives and lead to oftentimes a much richer analysis of impacts and the reasons for observed impacts. I realize that we're running out of time quickly, so I'm just speeding through, and I'll likely skip over some of the examples. So when designing our research instruments and conducting our primary research, then we need to ask ourselves, are our research instruments and the process of data collection really conceived to reflect gender roles, relations, and inequalities that might produce gender-based biases? So disaggregating data by sex, though necessary, is not a guarantee that the data collection instruments involved in the data production will necessarily address gender-based biases. So what are some of these biases? and what are the implications of not being aware of them? So firstly, gender stereotypes or norms can affect what type of data we collect and whom we collect it from. So for example, the gender stereotype that the man is the breadwinner and the woman is a housewife, and the assumption that informal and unpaid care work are less productive than formal market work has influenced the collection of employment data, privileging main jobs over secondary, seasonal, and unpaid jobs. And an example of this, Pakistan's 2005-6 labor force survey added an activity list to the employment questionnaire for the first time to better account for people engaged in unpaid and unregulated work. And so they included a range of home-based activities along with wage-based activities. And the table below shows that the formal labor force participation rate obtained for women using this expanded list more than doubles, from almost 20% to over 40%, whereas, surprisingly or not surprisingly, there was no change to men's labor force participation rates. So, skipping ahead. And another issue that stems from a similar bias is that questions end up being leading, influencing answers in a particular way, and that keywords should not apply exclusively to only one of the two sexes. So, for example, housewife or fisherman. When proxy respondents, usually male heads of households, are selected rather than individuals themselves, the information collected can be inaccurate or misleading. So, for instance, when the male head of a household is asked to report on the time that female household members spend collecting firewood or water, and when female household members are in some region asked to report on meter readings, which men in those areas might be more likely to be involved in, this can lead to undercounting. So just quickly moving on to the analysis bit. So it's important at this stage to unpack to the extent possible the gender dimensions of different social groups. So not just disaggregating into binary categories, but looking at intersectionalities of ethnicity, of income, and race. A really powerful analysis that was done by Women's Budget Group that I came across that did this looked at the impact of austerity policies across different groups, and they found that individuals in the poorest households did lose the most from these policy changes, but that in every income group, Black and minority ethnic women lost the greatest proportion of their income. So we sometimes use secondary sources of data or information for our analysis, such as income or employment data from official databases, but we do so without critically engaging with them and understanding how they've been constructed and how or whether they've incorporated a gender perspective. So some time ago, while preparing a comparative study on global trends on gender equality, I came across the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, which seeks to capture the relative gaps between women and men across different areas, and then comes up with a ranking of these countries by their achievements in gender equality. And I noticed and was puzzled by how countries like Rwanda, the Philippines, and Nicaragua have higher ratings than rankings than countries like Denmark, and the Netherlands, and the UK. And upon kind of closer inspection, I realized that this was primarily a study of the gaps between men and women, and not necessarily their overall levels of well-being in these areas. So putting it crudely, if men and women were equally illiterate or likely to die at an earlier age, countries did okay or well in those rankings. Gaps favoring women also put countries in higher rankings. So this is not to say that this index is biased or isn't useful or shouldn't be used, or that there is a perfect index out there without any limitations, but that we need to be clear about the message the data allows us to convey and what it allows us to say and what it doesn't allow us to say. And then moving on to presenting and influencing around our research, are we being careful not to aggregate and collapse gender differences into larger categories where the gender differences disappear? And I will skip this example, sadly, because we're running out of time.
Thank you, Anam. Yeah, I think it would be great if we could leave about 10 minutes for Q&A.
I will just stop there then. And that's pretty much the last slide.
And I just want to remind everybody to please type your questions in the chat box to all the panelists so that we can see, we can see your questions. And Anam and Emily, if you're ready for some of the questions that were already asked, one of them referred to the cash transfer study in Nairobi. What would have been a transformative element that could have been part of that study? And then if you want to add anything to the role of quantitative research methods, I know you addressed that point later in the presentation, but if you wanted to add anything, if you can take these two questions, and I will keep asking the other one.
Sure. I can go ahead and start with the gender transformative. How could we make the Nairobi case study gender transformative? And I think that's such a great question. And I think one of the challenges with the study is that I guess they went in and they were like, oh, we're going to look at 4 groups and women will be there. And so we'll take, because we're talking to both men and women, it'll be fine. But that's not how it works, right? Unfortunately, you have to have a gender analysis, a gender lens where you're thinking about the roles that women play in these contexts and what that means in terms of power relations vis-a-vis other stakeholders such as men who tend to have more power, et cetera. So I think in terms of getting this research project and actually the project itself, right, that the research was studying to a much more gender transformative area would involve looking at it from the very beginning, thinking about these questions of the context and the gendered structures and power relations from the very beginning, and being very careful to note who we're talking about, which women in these communities in Nairobi. Are we talking, what sort of ethnic groups, what level of education, how do these all sort of impact what we're studying? And I also think, going back to what the research was talking about in terms of like a self-reflection or like a reflective analysis of, the shortcomings, which was basically saying, the participants were really concerned about what was going to happen in terms of their relationships in the household after the cash transfer project ended, because there was no exit strategy. There was no sort of okay, so, if we don't have this cash transfer, what does that then mean in terms of women and men's experience of, domestic violence, for example? And I think if you had that contextual analysis from the very beginning, there would have been greater awareness of these potential pitfalls. I'm not saying this would have led to magic solutions per chance, but, it definitely, this do no harm aspect, I think, of gender feminist research would have really come into play. And then I think connecting into a more gender transformative sort of research, connecting it more towards, the structural relations around cash and food insecurity in Kenya, I think would have been really interesting, not only focusing on what's going on in the slums that were targeted for the project, but then connecting it to a wider analysis of what's going on politically, economically, socially. Anam, I don't know if you wanted to add to anything around that, or if you wanted to talk about the gender quant question.
Yeah, sure. So I think there definitely is a role. And like I said, quantitative methods are incredibly useful for highlighting gender inequalities, but also for putting issues on political agendas. So working in Pakistan, for example, just based on my own experience with different government organizations and various ministries, the type of evidence that government officials were most moved or convinced by were quantitative. So you could call this a kind of bias, so to speak, but that is the reality of the matter, and different types of evidence can be more convincing to certain audiences than others. Also, what we've seen is that many of the important issues to women are also areas that are not counted and are invisible in measures of economic progress and are hence ignored in policy analysis. And as a result, underinvested in. So I do think a greater effort is required to measure these particular aspects. And then I wanted to share a really good example of where quantitative evidence gathering to bridge some of these evidence gaps actually influenced policy making. So in Uruguay, it's one of the few countries which has really addressed the challenge of measuring unpaid care work. So they carried out a nationally representative time use survey, which has been conducted in other countries but has not really been taken up by your mainstream ministries of finance and economics. And it actually paved the way and directly influenced a national level policy, a national care policy. So it's a really interesting example of kind of a virtuous cycle in data advocacy and policy. And I can share a link to this great case study.
Oh, that would be great.
For more information.
Yeah.
I also see in the chat box a little bit earlier on, somebody noted that something about heteronormative relationships. And I think that's really important. I just want to read it out because I think it's so key and something I'm struggling with myself, that heteronormative stereotypes are also very common and with very little info on same-sex families, and it may be hard to overcome due to social and political context. And that's something I know that has been a conversation at Oxfam America quite often, which is, we want to be as representative and, we want to be inclusive, and we want to be aware that we're working with populations that are marginalized. And however, we are working in contexts where LGBT relationships, for example, are criminalized. And but that doesn't mean that we don't do anything in our research. It's just that maybe there's additional sensitivities and ways to go that we need to work within our research process to make sure that we are still being inclusive without outing anybody or causing further harm to anybody. But it's definitely something we're still, I think I would say, new at and trying to get better at, and it's a conversation. But yeah, it's just really important to recognize that when we're going in our research, that sometimes we're sticking to the heteronormative conceptions of families just because that's easier. But that's, again, not the whole truth. Sorry, Dana, please go ahead.
No. So maybe we have time for 2 more questions if we can answer these briefly. And please, to all the participants, please post your questions. We will answer in writing the ones that we are not able to take on live right now, just in the interest of time. So the last 2 questions that we can address live, one from Dina. It would be interesting to talk a little bit about how these research topics are developed in the first place and how often these interventions are based on assumptions that we have about what would be good for people based on a specific worldview. And then there's the second part of the question, I think, Anna that you can see. I'm just reading out loud the second question for the participants, and then if you can respond. This is interesting as, yes, gender is cross-cutting to everything we do. This question is, how do power dynamics within the research team factor into gender transformative research, if at all? For example, research assistants, field staff, program managers, and things like that. Thank you.
Great.
Did you want to take the first and I'll take the second?
Sure. I have stuff to say on both too. So
okay, yeah, sure. I mean,
yeah, no worries. We'll see how much time. Okay, so the first one, how research topics are developed. Yeah, I think that's really crucial. And for example, working at Oxfam, I sometimes get research topics kind of presented to me as well. Like, I don't necessarily have much influence on the main sort of topic, while I can figure out the details, depending on whether we get it from a grant or whether it's not, right? So that's also very interesting, where we come up with this idea based on a funder, and then we go and here's our idea and let's implement it. But there's no real engagement or possible engagement with our key stakeholders in influencing those research questions. However, with another research project I'm working on women's leadership and humanitarian action, because we had the luxury of unrestricted funding to work on that research topic, we really did try to, well, we came up with a general idea to guide the conversation, and then we worked with women's organizations in our two case study countries, Bangladesh and South Sudan, to refine that idea and to make it more relevant to what their country context would be. You know, just try to be clear, like, hey, we're posing this idea, this question, just to start a conversation, but we're open to what you are thinking would be best. However, because we are a funder, an international NGO, it was interesting to see how, in, let's say, the case of Bangladesh, I really got the sense from the women's organization we were working with that they weren't comfortable in providing that critique and providing that kind of input. While in South Sudan, it wasn't the case. Like, there was definitely a back and forth and, you know, a constant revising around what we were going to study before actually implementing the research. So it's kind of, I'm not sure if there's a magic solution, but it's definitely something that we are both constrained because of our role in an organization like, let's say, like an Oxfam. But at the same time, Oxfam is also creating opportunities to try to overcome them. And so it's been kind of fascinating to see these two separate research projects I just described kind of unfold. But yeah, let me stop there because I know we're running out of time. Go ahead, Anam.
Yeah, so I think the question around how power dynamics within research teams factor into our research, into gender transformative research, I think it's critical. It's absolutely critical to address. And this has really been a challenge that we've really tried to be cognizant of in our research recently. So in a piece of feminist participatory action research, for instance, in Tunisia on promoting women's active fiscal citizenship, really seeing our role, and by our I mean external researchers from, you know, based in Oxford, based in the north, going into these communities, really seeing our roles as walking alongside not only women and their communities, but also our local Oxfam staff, local researchers, and the field research team. And it kind of, again, brings up this question of, well, whose knowledge matters? And there is this assumption oftentimes that we may know better because we have this global perspective. And it's really one that we have to continue to question and challenge ourselves. Or the fact that we are going in to develop the capacity through trainings and information sharing of the local staff, and it's not necessarily unidimensional. So I think it's really, really critical. And gender transformative research should look to seriously address all kinds of power imbalances, not only between researchers and communities, so to speak, but also within the research team. And realizing and adopting an intersectional approach to that. And, you know, just because I'm a woman, a Pakistani woman working in the UK, I'm still quite privileged in a lot of ways. So being really aware of my own privilege and power is really important.
Right. Well, thank you, Anam and Namali, so much for this presentation. It was very interesting. We have lots of questions, and just to remind everybody that we will email you these slides. As you can see on the screen, the last slide has links to the resources, including the guideline that we went into more depth today. I don't think the guideline is, we have a question if it's customized for financial inclusion, but the webinar today was served that purpose, and maybe, hopefully, you know, through FinEquity, we can have further conversations of how to adapt the guideline to specifically to financial inclusion, maybe women's economic empowerment. If you, so Anam and Namali, thank you again so much. We really appreciate your presentation today. And if you can, if people can hang on for a couple of seconds, I have some FinEquity announcements one, and you will see the link in the chat box as well. Please fill out our member survey. This is a 4 to 5 minute survey. It will help us a lot to make FinEquity better. We want to be responsive, if not transformative. Definitely don't want to go blind, as we learned today. So please do that. Another announcement, we have an upcoming online discussion between June 11th and the 13th. The discussion is focused on how do social norms impact women's financial inclusion and how can they be shifted to promote inclusion. The link to register for that online discussion is in the chat box as well, and we will you will see this advertised to all of our channels, but and you are the first ones to find out about it today, so sign up. And lastly, if you're not already a FinEquity member, or if you're not already part of all of our platforms, there are two ways to join. One, joining the group. This is where we discuss, collaborate, share publications. The link is now in your chat box. You can also follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and you can sign up to our newsletter, and this is how you get announcements. We communicate to all of these platforms, so it's great to be on all of them. And then people use, sometimes people use Twitter more than LinkedIn, and we just want to capture everyone. So once again, thank you to everybody who joined, and especially to our panelists. And we will follow up with the presentation, the recording, and answers to the questions that we were not able to answer live. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us, folks on FinEquity.